Welcome to Closer to Venus. I'm Johnny Burke, and today's guest is Stephen Weinstock. He is a musician, Akashic Records reader, and author of the fantasy series, The Reincarnation Chronicles, which, inspired by his psychic and past life experience, allows his work as a novelist to reach new spiritual horizons. In this episode, we'll discuss accessing past lives through the imagination. Stephen, welcome to the program.
Thanks, Johnny. I'm glad to be here.
The Reincarnation Chronicles, that's a fantasy series about a qaraq, which is a group of connected souls that discover that they've had shared past lifetimes together.
That's right. They're like a soul family.
Soul family, okay. I think it's pretty much the same thing then.
That's right.
Okay, good. How did you discover the qaraq, and how did you understand that it was basically the same thing as a soul family?
So it took quite a while for me to make the connection. I'll just talk a minute about the source of the fantasy series and how it led me to the idea of the qaraq, because that wasn't the original concept. The original concept was about reincarnation, but it was literary. I sort of had this idea for a novel where the chapters were really small and didn't make sense. They were like déjà vus. And then as you read, they started making connections with each other, and you realized you were experiencing a past life narrative. And I thought, well, that's a nice idea, but I was a musician and a composer. I'm not a writer. I put it aside. And then a number of years later, it came back to me, and I realized a way to make it work, which is using the structure of the 1001 Nights, the Arabian Nights and the Scheherazade. At first, I thought there would be 1001 of these small little chapters, but the chapters got bigger and bigger as I started working on it. I looked at the Scheherazade story, and it's one of the greatest stories ever. And so I based my main characters on those characters. So there's a modern day Scheherazade and a modern day king and so forth. And once I started developing that and researching past lives a little bit more, I realized, this has got to be a group of people that have gone through many lifetimes together. And really the idea of the book is no longer these short chapters with déjà vus, but their stories. Every chapter somebody will remember and recount a story, but it'll only be a piece of their history. What it became is it's about a group of people in the present day who have the super ability to remember their past lives, and they meet up with each other. This is a rare time when they're all living in the same time and place, and they remember their lives and they put together this history. Somewhere in there, I came up with the word qaraq. This is how I designated them, and this is really going to be the center of the series. So all of that said, it was maybe a year or two later that I came across the idea of a soul family or a soul circle that was out there in the reincarnation community. So this is really one of the examples that we're talking about today, where the imagination, maybe it wasn't my imagination, maybe it was a memory of a soul family or the idea. Somehow I was tapped into this psychic intuition of what a soul family was, even though I felt like it came out of my imagination.
The intuitives and the mediums that have been on the podcast, they were starting to recognize themes of past lives and reincarnation in some of these stories, which are hundreds of years old, and probably had an influence and motivation for the writer. Does that make sense?
Yes, it does. It does very much.
We're seeing a lot more of fiction, but it's based on past life memories, where the author, the intuitive in this case, is actually very conscious of the fact that this work was based on my past life memories, whereas before, the writer may or may not have been aware of that.
Right. It's fascinating.
Yes. Now, speaking of past lives and reincarnation, do you have any experiences of your own?
Yes, I didn't have any experience coming into the series. I just was interested in the idea of reincarnation, but once I started doing research and writing, I realized I should be having the experience that my characters are having. I mean, they're undergoing past life regression. So I started looking for a past life regressionist, and I found Michelle Brock, and I did a number of sessions with her. She's become a great friend over the years. She's a wonderful practitioner. She studied with Dr. Brian Weiss, who wrote Many Lives, Many Masters. So she uses that methodology. I did about 3 or 4 sessions with her, maybe recalled about a dozen different lifetimes. One example was I remember being a Lenape Indian in the area that's now New Jersey. And the first image I got was running away from my tribe along a riverbed, and arrows were flying past me. Something had happened. I had done something. I had rebelled, broken some law, and was being banished. And I didn't quite see it clearly the first time, but we revisited this world a couple times, and I was running away with my wife and my son at that time. Now, what's interesting is that I was living in New Jersey at the time with my wife and my son, and the Lenape Trail is up in the Montclair Hills, and we would take hikes up there. And there was one image from one of the memories I had of standing on a promontory, having gotten away, and we were safe. And I was looking out over New Jersey and the New York Harbor in the distance. And one day my wife and I were hiking the Lenape Trail, and we took a side trail, and there was the promontory. So there were things like that. And also when I started writing stories based on the Lenape experience for the series, I would come up, invent details for the stories. And when I would revisit the world with Michelle, some of those details would come up. Now, that begs the question, was my imagination influencing my past life regressions, vice versa? At this point, I don't have any of those questions anymore. The imagination and psychic intuition both come out of the same source, which is the unconscious. And I think it's all good. They all interact with each other, and I'll talk about a number of cases of this interaction.
Good, good. And because what I'm told from the regressionist point of view is that the difference between dreams or your own memories is that the past life memories are very vivid. They don't just fade away. Did you find the same thing?
Not really. I find they certainly stuck with me. They didn't fade away. But in going under hypnosis and coming up with the memory, I don't have a very strong visual sense in reality. I'm not that observant visually. You can just ask my wife and she'll corroborate that. But the visual is very murky to me. And Michelle said that's only one way to really take in psychic information. Another way is if you have thoughts that just come into your head. And that's really, I live in my head a lot. So that was really my strength. So she said, whenever you see an image, if it's murky, just ask yourself, what is that? And a thought would always pop into my head. That's how I rolled during regressions.
Now, speaking of the regressions and the memories in general, did you get to experience the life in between lives, in between incarnations?
I did in some of the regressions. In Dr. Weiss's methodology, you go through a lifetime and look at maybe 2 or 3 events. Then the last thing that you're asked to look at is after your death, what was your soul lesson? What did your soul get out of this lifetime? And sometimes the lesson just popped into my head, but at other times I would have a memory of meeting with a spirit guide or a master in the interlife, and we would be processing stuff, and out of that I'd learn what the lesson was. So it was more of an interaction. That was one way that I think I remembered some lifetimes between lifetimes. But here's another answer, which I kind of love. When I was a kid, I was probably 7 or 8 years old, and kids at that age start thinking about life and death and afterlife and wondering what heaven is and all of that. And this idea came to me that when we die, we are brought to a place where we watch a movie of our life, of every second of our life. And later on, when I read Brave New World, I realized what I was thinking of was more like Huxley's feelies. You not only watch your life, but you feel it again, and you have your thoughts, and you have all your sensual memories and so forth. And then you watch part of your life, and then you have a meeting with somebody, and you review it, and you talk about what you've learned and what you could have done better and so forth. You watch another chunk of your life. You go through your whole life, and then, I don't know why I thought this as a kid, you go through the whole thing again, and you review until you really get what you're supposed to get, and your soul is purified for that particular lifetime. And it was in college, I read about William Butler Yeats and his idea of the dreaming back, which is exactly the same idea, that a soul in the afterlife will review their lives. And then years after that, as I was doing research for the series. There's all kinds of books about the lifetimes between lives. And I realized as a kid, I had this idea already in my imagination. But again, was it maybe my memory of my previous life as a kid? I wasn't that far away from it.
Apparently, we have all had hundreds, if not thousands, of past lives. When you talk about, I believe you called it the inner life, in between incarnations, were you able to experience any of the planning of the next incarnation, or did you not get quite that far?
I never got quite that far, but that's certainly a recurrent theme in the series where the karma that the qaraq is working out, somebody is in their inner life and they're given a choice of what their next life will be, given what's happening with the other members of the qaraq, or they're assigned a life because they need to further a lesson. All of that's a very rich source of ideas for me.
What you talked about before, where you met with a spirit guide, that sounds like a life review. Where,
yes.
And correct me if I'm wrong, it's not as if you were being judged. It's more like someone is asking, how do you think you did?
Yeah. Yeah. One of the main characters in the series is Elvie, and she's the qaraq spirit guide, and she incarnates into the world in the present day because it's a rare time when her group is all together. But they have a lot of memories of meeting with her in the interlife over a cup of tea, reviewing things. And she's very cagey. She's a fun character. She doesn't just tell them what they're supposed to learn. She wants them to figure it out. And in the present life, she also doesn't give them too much information. They beg her for information a lot of times, and they've got to figure it out.
Now, speaking of spirit guides, one of the things that you brought up the last time we spoke was that there's an imaginal process where the imagination fills the gaps. But couldn't that actually be just a spirit guide?
Yeah, I like to think of the idea of the infinite intelligence, which is that higher power that guides us and sometimes gives us information and sometimes works with serendipity to make something happen in our lives. And this is a theme in the series a lot, of the infinite intelligence at work with the qaraq and putting two souls together in a particular lifetime or what have you. But there are a lot of times when I manifest the infinite intelligence as a group of spirit guides, meeting in a back room, smoking and having turkey club sandwiches and arguing over the direction a soul should take in their next life, that kind of thing. I do think that sometimes when I have to fill in information about a past life, that I'm channeling that infinite intelligence. Yeah.
You hit the nail on the head there, channeling, because I think we all channel. That's what I'm told anyway. And a lot of those bits of intelligence or intuition or whatever you want to call them is from another source, whether it's a past life memory or if it's channeled. Can you actually tell the difference?
Not always. And again, I think because the imagination and intuition come from the unconscious, I think there's very thin lines between all of that. And sometimes one encourages the other. Okay, I did a workshop with Dr. Brian Weiss once where there's 1,000 people in the room and he's regressing everybody. And it's crazy, but it actually works because every individual is relaxing themselves and going into trance and coming up with their past life. And he did one exercise with us where he wanted us to foresee a future life. I had a very murky image of a futuristic house. I could tell the architecture was what I just felt that it was beyond modern. I couldn't quite see it. And I said, I've got to use my imagination. What is this? I know it's the future. And the house started taking shape, but something else then happened. The experience leaped over into a narrative. And I saw my wife and I inside the house. Some strange vessel landed next to the house. We were abducted. It was an alien abduction narrative, but we were brought to another world, and the emperor of that world said, I'm sorry for taking you away from your home, but I'm very curious about your species. And that's about as far as the narrative went. But that was such almost a disconnect or a leap from just seeing this futuristic architecture to a whole story. I knew that I wasn't making that up. It wasn't coming out of my imagination. It just appeared to me. But was it imaginal? Was it intuitive? It's hard to tell the difference.
Okay, all right. How did the Akashic Records reading figure into your workflow?
I had become aware of what the Akashic Records were, this idea of a storehouse or a book or a library somewhere that contained every soul's past life history. And I figured I have to learn more about that at some point. That sounds like a great source of ideas for the series. I saw an ad on Facebook for a webinar, free webinar, about how to read the Akashic Records. And this was given by Andrea Hess, who's a wonderful Akashic Records practitioner and a great teacher. And boy, was I hooked by her webinar. She was fascinating. She uses a lot of other modalities to do a reading. So there was a lot of hints of what you would learn. So I signed up for her course and I learned how to read the Akashic Records. And I've done readings for a couple dozen friends. I didn't go into it as a business because I'm too busy writing now. And I certainly never used my friends' lifetimes as material for stories, but I did readings for myself, and I've used that as materials for stories. But Andrea Hess's methodology is interesting because at one point it really requires using the imagination, I think. You're certainly using your intuition. You meditate and you go into a light trance before you do any work. You come up with about a list of 25 possible things that could happen in someone's past lives. Did they undergo a curse? What was the sort of spheres of protection that was around their soul? How many spirit guides were guiding them at that particular time? And you just have this big list. And then she has a simple method where you can divide that list up into about 2 or 3 past lives that the person needs to hear about right now. But again, you just have 2 or 3 lists. And then she said you have to do what she calls detective work, but I think it's really imaginal work, where you just start asking questions for each list. What's the first thing that happened here? Then how did that happen? And who was involved there? And then what was the outcome of that? And you develop a very detailed narrative of each of these past lives. What you wind up with is something that's really serving the person's present life. It's not about the fantasy of what their past life was about. It's more about what they can learn from it. And everybody I've done a reading for, there's been lots of information that they can really use in this life. So they're rich stories that I come up with. But I think it's, again, that place between imaginal and intuitive work that comes out of the subconscious. That's the important part of that methodology.
So there is an intersection between the Akashic Records and the past lives. That's what it sounds like.
Absolutely. They're a record of past lives, yes.
Okay. Let's go back to the workshop you did with Brian Weiss. He mentioned at one point he wanted you and the other students to imagine a future life. So during these discussions, did he ever explain how everything is happening at once? In other words, past, future, and concurrent lives. Did that come up?
I do believe he talked about that at one time. I don't remember any details. In between each exercise that he gave us, he would lecture a little bit. And I do remember that idea of thinking about time. It's probably when he was introducing the future exercise. And for anybody who felt, gee, I thought you just worked with past lives. Why are we looking ahead to future lives? I think he was introducing that possibility of recurrent lives, that it doesn't matter whether it's in the past or the future. Every time is happening simultaneously.
Because apparently in that space, when you're experiencing past lives or future lives or whatever you want to call them, as well as near-death experiences, apparently time is not like it is here. It seems like it doesn't even exist. Did you ever get that sense during the regression sessions that you did?
I never felt that, but again, in my imagination and working on the series, I've come across that idea a lot, that it's almost like I've been forced as a writer to acknowledge that idea. It's going to make something work in my narrative. Particularly when I write about the inner life, it's as if that's in a no space, a no time place. And someone can be in the life between lives and not only see their history, but they can see ahead as well if they need to. And again, working with the spirit guides will enable that freedom of looking anywhere in time when a soul needs to experiencing that and understand something and make a connection.
In your experience, when you did encounter spirit guides, did they mention that you could actually look ahead? That's something I've never heard before.
I don't recall a spirit guide saying that. My memories with spirit guides were in the life review idea. I don't ever remember them. And of the few precognitions that I experienced of the future, I'm sure I was asked, what lesson will you learn at the end of that life?
Did you experience them at some point, like during the life review or anywhere or at any time during the regressions?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, that's how the lesson would come up from a conversation.
That's what I thought. Okay. In your experience between the Akashic Records and the past lives and the interlife, what are the most important takeaways for you in this case?
I think especially in preparing for this conversation, I've never really thought that deeply about the connection between the imagination and psychic intuition. I know that I've experienced one leading to the other all the time, but I think that's a big takeaway for me. And I'd even say for anybody out there listening, if you're a creative person, and obviously you're interested in spirituality because you're listening to this, that you shouldn't be afraid to mix the two, to come up with ideas for your creative work using whatever spiritual practice, tarot, I Ching, past lives. And for the people that work with past lives, if you've ever considered writing a book, either fiction or a self-help book or a nonfiction book, that don't be afraid to do that. There's going to be a very easy connection between what you've experienced with your intuition and what you can create.
I think we're going to see more people, more artists, musicians as well, actually acknowledge that they are being influenced by other sources, whether it's a past life memory or it's a spirit. But I do think we're going to see more and more of that fiction influenced by real past life memories. I think that could eventually be a new genre or a new subgenre.
I call it karmic lit for short.
I like that. All right. I might have to steal that from you.
Go for it.
Okay. All right. Stephen, thanks so much for joining us today. In the meantime, how can our listeners find you online?
My website, which is qaraqbooks.com. Qaraq is spelled Qaraq, qaraqbooks.com. And you'll find all my socials and more articles about reincarnation and more information about the series on the website.
Excellent. You've been listening to Closer to Venus. I'm Johnny Burke. If you enjoyed today's episode, please consider subscribing. In the meantime, you can find more information on closertovenus.com. Thanks again for tuning in, and we'll see you next time.